Okay, so in the last one we talked about how pathogens are able to arrive at specific portals of entry, typically sites with mucous membranes called mucosal tissue. Once they get into these portals of entry, they're able to begin the infection. In this video, we're going to talk about the development of the infection. We're going to talk about the two different immune responses as like a brief overview. We're going to go deeper into depth in future videos in the playlist. And then we're going to talk a bit about each of the stem cells that produce the different cells involved in the immune system. And then in the next few videos, we're going to talk about what these cells do in depth. So let's just get into it. With regards to development of an infection, initially there are going to be no or few symptoms, but as the infection progresses and the pathogens begin to proliferate, so the pathogens are replicating, symptoms are going to eventually appear. Bacterial and viral infections can cause similar symptoms, but there are some key differences that we're going to go over in future videos. They also have different treatments. Obviously, bacteria tend to be treated with antibiotics, and viruses tend to be treated with vaccinations that introduce weakened strains of the virus or just parts of the virus's membrane, the peptidoglycan membrane, to generate an adaptive immune response and produce antibodies that are going to be complementary to these proteins that come from the viruses. So, for example, they're going to introduce some epitope, which is just the thing that the antibody picks up. The antibody will pick up that epitope, and then we'll get our memory B cells that are going to provide resistance against the virus in the future. An end to symptoms typically represents the end of an infection, but this isn't always the case. It could just mean that the pathogen is entering an asymptomatic benign phase, which happens in herpes, where if you don't have a flare-up, the herpes pathogens are still in your, I believe, central nervous tissue. They're still there, but they're not causing a flare-up. Same thing for tuberculosis, which we talked a bit about last time. Mycobacteria infecting the vesicles of macrophages in the lungs. We have an immune response where a bunch of innate immune cells, like white blood cells, surround these infected white blood cells with TB, forming what is called a granuloma. These granulomas will expand. They're shown as these little white dots on the lungs in the photo in the bottom right. And then if they calcify, the mycobacteria can go into a dormant state, and then the symptoms of TB are going to subside for a while. You're not going to get spread of these mycobacteria until it reactivates its active state, and then you're going to see expansion of the disease. So, as you probably already know, there are two different forms of immune response. The innate immune response, which is basically the front line of our body's defenses. It's immediately available to combat a wide array of pathogens, but it provides no lasting immunity, and it's not specific for any particular pathogen. Meanwhile, the adaptive immune response is more akin to the special forces in the military. Military kind of references kind of help me remember a lot of stuff about the immune system. It's just an easier way to think about it if you have a lot of kind of molecular biology modules, which I do. The adaptive immune response is a bit more specialized. It takes time to develop, but it produces a specific immune response with antibodies complementary to specific pathogenic epitopes, and it basically opsonizes them, and it makes it easier for macrophages to phagocytize and destroy the pathogens. The adaptive immune response also produces memory B cells, which provide lasting immunity to the pathogen because it stores antibodies that are complementary to pathogenic epitopes, so pathogenic proteins. So if we ever encounter it again, we just activate these memory B cells into plasma cells. The plasma cells produce antibodies that are going to stick to the pathogen, and these antibodies are going to make it easier for cells like macrophages to what we call phagocytize the pathogen, basically envelop it and then digest it to destroy it. And obviously this response is specific to each pathogen because the antibodies are going to have different variable regions. The antibodies are basically specific to each pathogen. So now we're going to talk about the production of cells in our immune system. Our innate immune cells, so these ones here, they are the descendants of myeloid stem cells. Meanwhile, the cells of our adaptive immune system, so our natural killer cells, natural killer cells also have a role in the innate immune system, but for ease of it, natural killer cells, B cells and T cells, they are all the descendants of lymphoid stem cells. Now, obviously these are both going to be in the blood, in the bone marrow, or in different parts of the body, like we find T cells in the thymus, we find B cells in the bone marrow. I'd imagine we'd have lymphoid stem cells in the bone marrow. So obviously they're in the bone marrow. They may be in the thymus as well. Let me just go and check. Yeah, lymphoid stem cells, while they're initially produced, descended from hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow, which we're going to talk about in a minute. The lymphoid stem cells do migrate, some of them migrate to the thymus, where they're going to give rise to the T cells. Don't worry too much if you don't know what a thymus is. It's just a kind of fatty structure in front of the heart where we see our T cells develop, mature and specialize. We'll go into it in quite a bit of depth in the future. Platelets also are derived from these myeloid stem cells, so platelets are coming from the same stem cells producing our innate immune cells, and that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because platelets have a role of coagulating the blood to not only prevent blood loss, but also to form a scab, which is going to kind of act as a bit of a permeability barrier, not as good as the skin, but it's going to be better than nothing to seal breaches in the skin. So we're going to have fewer pathogens actually getting into the blood and doing some serious damage. Erythrocytes, which are just red blood cells, do not come from either myeloid or lymphoid stem cells. They come from erythroid stem cells, or otherwise called erythroblasts. All of these types of stem cells that we talked about, they can also be called progenitor cells. The terms can be used interchangeably, it doesn't really matter. It just means they're the precursors to the future cells shown here. But all of these different types of stem cells that we talked about, the myeloid, they give rise to the innate immune cells, lymphoid, which give rise to the adaptive immune cells, and the erythroid, which give rise to the red blood cells. They all are produced by the hematopoietic stem cells inside the bone marrow. The hematopoietic stem cells differentiate into these different types of stem cells, and then these stem cells differentiate further, that we talked about here and here, to serve their own functions.